in formulating the concept of synchronicity, Jung was suggesting that that to have a kind of a whole judgment, being able to rediscover a sense of meaning, a sense of the sacred, sense of the mysterious, at the same time as having all that sort of, everything, that all the critical faculties present and so on. That one doesn't. It's not a sort of a regression to a pre-disenchanted, pre-critical state where what I've sometimes referred to as naive enchantment and synchronicity. I would locate at the sort of re-enchantment end of things. I think that's what it's effectively doing. So someone's not negating the value of science or of causal thinking or anything, but one's, as it were, in some way transcending it whilst also including it.
Hi, I'm Ricky DeRiz. Welcome to episode 53 of the MindThatEgo Podcast. Roderick Main is a senior lecturer and deputy director in the Centre for Psychoanalytic Studies at the University of Essex, with a focus on religion, mythology, literature, and, of course, synchronicity. His books include Jung on Synchronicity and the Paranormal, The Rupture of Time, Breaking the Spell of Disenchantment, and Revelations of Chance. He is also a fellow co-author of the Playful Universe. To honour the purpose of that book, I was keen to approach synchronicity firstly from Roderick's personal experience, understanding how he interprets and unpacks their meaning, before moving into theoretical explanations. The result is a dialogue that provides practical ways to participate with synchronistic events, such as deciphering symbols and intuitively linking relevant associations. We look at different forms of synchronicity, including the personal, archetypal and collective, and the nuances of discernment. How do you tell genuine synchronicity from delusions or magical thinking? What are pathologies of meaning or dark synchronicities? What are the religious and philosophical implications? And what truly is the power of myth? All that and more coming up. Just a reminder before we jump into the conversation to please like, rate, subscribe and share to help more people access the podcast. Enjoy. Roderick, a very warm welcome to the MindThatEgo Podcast. I'm so excited to talk with you about the topic of synchronicity for a number of reasons. Firstly, in reading your work, I really like your approach to how you investigate synchronicity from the inside out, so to speak, through the experience of it. And I also really admire how you bring in, from that space, a lot of theoretical understanding, a lot of synthesis. And I feel there are many directions that we can go. That being said, I want to open with a quote of yours that I read. It's only a short one. I've learned not to not to read too much in the beginning of an episode. And that is, spiritual implications of numinosity, transcendence, miraculousness, revelation, and transformation present in synchronicities. Mm-hmm. I wonder, to talk around this subject, if you could begin, and I know it's almost like the first rule of synchronicity is don't talk about your own synchronicities, because they can sometimes lose that in translation. But this is something I was really impressed with in your story of the Mantis. So I wonder if you could begin by sharing that and how that was for you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for having me on your podcast. So the experience with the Mantis, this was, basically, I published a book called Revelations of Chance, which was based on my doctoral research, actually, and the publisher chose an image to go on the front, which was based by something that was written in the text, but was not flagged by me, and that was an image of a praying mantis. And the simple thing for me to do is just to show you that. Hopefully, it will be visible. There's a praying mantis at the center of the sort of title page, the cover page of the book. Rather nice image, and the publisher themselves clearly liked it as well, because they included it on their spring catalogue and so on. But it wasn't an image that I had suggested to them. It was one that they sort of captured from the way I begin the book with an anecdote about somebody else who had a synchronistic experience with involving the praying mantis. But the fact that it was put on the cover of my book made me take it a little bit more seriously. I began to contemplate the symbol a bit, and I was aware that some other people had very impressive synchronicities involving the praying mantis. I won't necessarily go into those now, but Joseph Campbell and Lorenz van der Post, both obviously with connections to Jung's work as well. So there was a sort of an accumulation of interest in me about this image of the mantis, even though it hadn't really sort of figured apart from in these ways, through my research and through the cover of the book in my own experience. Well, I was a year or so after the publication of my book, I went to Japan to visit my wife's family and my young children, and we as part of that visit, I took a copy of my book with me as a gift to my parents-in-law, and we visited a shrine near where they live, Mikamiyama shrine, and I was there, and my wife called me over. I was looking at one part of the temple, and my wife called me over, and she and our two young children, and my mother-in-law were in a circle around something. We went over, and it was a praying mantis, the first living one that I'd ever seen. It was surprisingly big. They're about 4 inches long. This one, they can be bigger than that, but that was, and it was exactly as on the cover of that book. That sort of green, and exactly looks like that. And so I joined them in the circle. And when I did so, the praying mantis, initially very still, just started stepping very gingerly, very sort of carefully towards where I joined the circle, and so in my direction. And then it sort of came right up to my shoe, climbed onto my shoe, and I thought this was really quite fascinating. And then, in a faster than you could imagine, it sort of scurried up my leg and up my torso. It came to rest over the left side of my chest, as over my heart, as I realized afterwards, and I sort of craned down and sort of looked at this creature that was on my chest, and the creature seemed to me to be in turn looking up at me. So we sort of, gazed at one another, as it were, for a few moments, and then I began to feel a little bit uncomfortable because these praying forearms that they have are actually not for praying; they're for cutting heads off. They're quite they can cause a bit of damage, and they've got a reputation, mantises, for taking on prey that is bigger than itself, and I was quite a lot bigger than it, but so I didn't know quite where they drew the line. But anyway, so after a while, I tried to get rid of the mantis by blowing it off my chest. So I started gently, as one might do with an insect, but this was a rather big insect, and so I blew harder, and it still didn't come off. And then eventually, my mother-in-law, seeing my intention, just sort of flicked it off and off my chest, and that was the end of the experience. So that was for me quite a powerful experience, because I'd been interested, growing interest, because of this image being put on the cover of my book in the figure of the mantis, but I hadn't really sort of engaged with it very much. And then suddenly, for the first time I'd ever seen a live one, not only did I see it, but it sort of seemed to come up to me, and it seemed to climb up me, and seemed to stare at me. It was really quite a sort of shocking moment. Although I didn't know quite what to do with it at the time very much, and I just sort of registered it, realized it was, as these things go, quite a significant experience, and also realized I wasn't going to forget it, so I didn't need to kind of feel I needed to crack the nut of what it might mean straight away, So I just sort of took it on board, and carried on with life, and but it's continued to sort of be something that I do return to and think about, and I use that as the example in the essay that I wrote for this book that's going to be coming out on what's called Playful Universe, is it?
Playful Universe.
Playful Universe, yeah. So and I've done a bit of thinking about the meaning of it, but maybe I don't know if there's anything you want to say before I move on to anything else about it.
Only in the sense of, as you describe it, it's already in itself, it is already fascinating to have that experience and to have those dots joined in the physical. And I know that a big part of your approach is looking at that, the underlying association, what the symbol of it means, as you say, like that initially knowing there was kind of meaning, but not rushing into trying to understand immediately. For you, in your approach, regardless of the theory, the philosophy, but in your personal approach, when something like that happens, how do you relate that to your inner world? What is the process for you?
Okay, I mean that's a very good question, and in a sense, it's the kind of, for me, the kernel of why these things are interesting. That one can do that. So I suppose what I try to do, I mean, maybe not everything that looks like a synchronicity is a synchronicity. So, but some things I think some things have a sort of a charge and a power that marks them out. And when I sense that might be the case, the sort of things I do, and I'm going to mention this in a sort of somewhat schematic way, but it's not really how it happens in practice. In practice, it's all kind of bundled together and much more confused, of course. But I try to sort of unpack what it might mean. I mean, for Jung, a synchronicity is a where events, usually psychic and physical events, are connected acausally through meaning. So the key thing really is, what is the meaning that is connecting them? And I think there are in an approach that I've sort of adapted really from the work of Robert Aziz, who first wrote about this in a fine book he wrote on synchronicity back in 1990. I've adapted a sort of way of looking at different levels of meaning in synchronicities, and the first thing I think one needs to do, or first thing I would do, is sort of identify what the actual points of paralleling are between the events that one's thinking of as constituting the synchronicity. So in this case, there was my interest, the psychic experience, if you like, or the psychic state, was my growing interest in the scarab. Not scarab, I'm the wrong insect now. Getting drawn into.
You do mention the scarab as well.
I'm getting usurped by Jung here.
Yeah.
The mantis. That was there it was my interest in the mantis, and there was this sort of psychic state, as it were, and then the mantis appeared in reality at the shrine and behaved in the way that it did. But it wasn't just the image of the mantis. There were also other details that I think are relevant, and one is that the image appeared on a book which was about subtitled Revelations of Chance, subtitled Synchronicity as Spiritual Experience. The whole thing was about spiritual experience, and the creature, sort of, when it appeared at a shrine, so I think there's also a strong association with the sacred, with the spiritual in this image, and of course, that's is substantiated by all the associations to the mantis, which we'll perhaps get onto. So first of all, I try and find the points of paralleling. So it was associated with in both the psychic and the physical events were involved. The sacred, the idea of the sacred. They also involved the idea of synchronicity, actually, because it was the image was on a book on synchronicity, and the experience was a synchronicity, so those are the sort of that's the general image that I'm sort of confronted with, the mantis, sort of with associations of the sacred and synchronicity. So a second level of kind of meaning that I think is important, and in sort of thinking about these things, is the sort of affective or emotional dimension, the non-rational, non-discursive element, just that sheer shock it gives you when you have such an experience, that sheer sort of sense of something strange going on, something that you know is there's something more there, but you don't know what. Jung used the word numinosity a lot to describe that sort of experience. So there was this sort of numinousness, and I think that's important both for spurring one to more kind of discursive inquiry into what the experience might mean. It grips you and makes you think, what does this mean? And you make some effort to try and explore possible associations and so on. But it also, once one goes on that sort of journey of trying to find out what it might mean, the numinosity or the feeling of that sort of emotional quality to it can kind of guide how one, picks one's way through all the information that one might encounter, which interpretations seem to resonate most, which ones seem to reflect genuinely what the power of that experience was, and so on. So that sort of luminousness is almost like a sort of a non-verbal, non-discursive apprehension of what the thing means that is sort of guiding one's attempt to explicate more sort of discursively what it means. So then there's the two further sort of levels of meaning that I try to explore, which are, if you could call them, the sort of personal or transformative, and then the sort of transpersonal or objective or archetypal, and the first of those, the transformational or subjective meaning, is really, what did the experience mean to me? Was its effect on me? How did it transform my thinking about things and my experience? How did it, ultimately, how did it abet, if you're thinking in Jungian terms, how did it abet my own process of individuation? And the ways in which I think in this case maybe it did were that it sort of prompted me to take more seriously again the topic of synchronicity, and in particular the spiritual aspect of synchronicity, at a time when in my own work at my university, I suppose I put that a bit on the back burner, because I work in quite a secular modern university that doesn't really sort of take these sorts of things. There's no Department of Religious Studies in my university. Okay. There's no sort of real exploration of this sort of thing. So I'd let it sort of take a bit of a back seat in my work. But this experience made me feel, well, maybe I should not neglect it. Maybe there was something. Maybe I should sort of focus some energy on that and find a way of doing it. So it did have that kind of effect on me. It also, the mantis, the term mantis in, it's a Greek word meaning also soothsayer, diviner, seer. It's the whole idea of divination is sort of implied in this word that has been come to be used in many Western languages for mantis, So it also, I suppose, reinforced my sense of the importance of divination as an area through which to explore synchronicity. And a third aspect that was kind of very personal, I suppose, was the fact, the sort of the way in which it happened. That it wasn't me individually sort of finding this thing or whatever. It was my family who had found it and were around it, and they called me over. So there was a sense of that my sort of individual private inquiries and so on were perhaps shouldn't be as much divorced from my sort of more practical and familial life as they were. So it just made me think about that anyway. So that's the third kind of level, personal, how it might have affected me. And then the fourth level, the sort of transpersonal or level, is really one where it's difficult to say quite what it means, because it's, by its nature, it's sort of encompassing or something which is beyond one's own sort of purview to a large extent. But, within, a lot of things resonated with me in sort of building up the power, my sense of the power of this symbol as something that is not just about what I'm interested in, but is a symbol that maybe has some meaning beyond its meaning for me. And that is all these sort of global associations with the idea of the spiritual and the religious in lots of different traditions. It's and a whole variety of sort of features about it, which I sort of describe in my book, largely spiritual ones, but also strange ones about its practice of sort of cannibalism, sexual, killing its mate after intercourse, the females, and so on. That sent off some worrying thoughts.
Can imagine.
And other associations, some very curious ones. I mentioned about in my essay about how it was associated with. It has been associated with sort of, sort of figures that appear in sort of alien abduction narratives in contemporary, sort of particularly in North America, but more globally than that. And there was actually, when I first talked about this, one of the first times I talked about this, there was, or when I was in the middle of writing this paper, actually, somebody, Jeff Kripal, who was at the same conference as me, was also quite independently of me talking about some of these kinds of experiences with mantis-like figures and so on. And a lot of the information that I gleaned actually came appositely, synchronistically from that. So there was a synchronicity involved in the very way in which at the very time which I was working on this. And that's not something that's not uncommon, actually, but they seem to be generative. So anyway, I've spoken a bit too much there, but there's a sort of a sense of the field of how I try to explore some of what these things might mean,
Yeah.
And I think the symbolic character is really important in that, actually.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. And it's not too much at all. For me, this really, really stood out in my own experiences. In the Playful Universe, the essay I write there is the yoga of knowledge. And part of that is related to a lot of synchronicities I had, where there was a bridge between, I didn't want to move my camera, but just on the top of that shelf, there's a headless Buddha. And it was an experience when the Buddha fell off the shelf.
Oh, yes.
Landed on the floor, the head came off. In a really peculiar way, like you say, there was that affect to it of, oh God, is this a bad omen? I was just about to travel at the time. And anyway, through that process, in the morning before traveling, I picked up Alan Watts' The Wisdom of Insecurity. And there were a lot of synchronicities around it, but even in the introduction by Deepak Chopra that I read on the flight, so that happened, I left, got on the flight, opened the book. And one of the things he said was, and I'm paraphrasing, Alan Watts is known to smash idols. And he introduces later in the book the headless way. And that was like, there was an association between that. And the reason I bring that up is that I've started to notice that there is, in my experience, a participation. It's almost like there's an invitation and a participation, and at the same time, the invitation isn't something that can be controlled or wished up from the conscious mind. But once the invite is there, it's almost like there are threads that you can consciously pull, and there are things that you can explore. And I resonate a lot with that schema that you present, and I think this is really important because it activates. For me, I think of the detective archetype, where it's just like, oh, like you're investigating, you're studying the synchronistic phenomena. And for me, and I know you talk about this, the word enchantment became almost a symbol in itself for me when I started to experience this. and had various synchronicities around symbols and around the usual like dream images and stuff like that as well. So I really value that overlay. For you as well, I wonder, you mentioned like the affect and the emotional charge. And synchronicity does have that ability. I think you mentioned, I can't remember who said it initially, but this phrase ontological shock. But there's like that's striking, and your experience sounded very much striking.
Yeah.
I wonder if you also experience synchronicity in your research and as part of your vocation as an academic, and whether that is, if there's a scale to that, whether sometimes it's just like, oh, that's curious, I was just thinking about that, and then I've just read a passage on Jung that relates to this essay. Is that something that you experience, almost like scales of synchronicity?
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily think of it in terms of scales, but I know what you mean. It's and certainly I'm very interested in how thinking synchronistically, if you like, or having the idea of synchronicity in mind can play its way into other orders of activity, like you know, in my case, academic work. You know, I mean, what role does it play? Can it legitimately play? And I think this was part of Jung's original intention with his writings on synchronicity. I mean, his major essay on synchronicity and a causal connecting principle, it starts with by saying, you know, that our sort of knowledge culture, dominated by science and experimental science in particular, provides us with what he called a sort of, you know, a psychologically biased partial view, because it can show us the causal connections amongst events quite brilliantly, establish those, and enable us to give us, enable us to have great power over our environment and so on in so many ways, and to develop technologies and so on. All of which, you know, Jung is not sort of denigrating. But it does that at the expense of sort of filtering out or sidelining certain less repeatable kinds of experiences, anomalous experiences, but also the whole sort of qualitative dimension of our experience. You know, the whole sort of emotional and meaningful domain of our experience. So yeah, so his idea of introducing the concept of synchronicity was to provide a way, not of replacing anything that science is doing, but to complement it with a different way of looking, where one looks at events that happen not just in terms of what causes and effects connect the events, but also in terms of what patterns of meaning events form when you sort of view them as a whole, you know, in a sense, regardless of the causal connections that may or may not exist amongst them. You know, when events fall together in certain ways, what do those patterns in which the events fall together mean? How can one read one's reality in a different way? And I think he's trying to sort of, he's suggesting that in order to achieve what he later on in the essay calls a whole judgment, one needs to combine the sort of causal and acausal or synchronistic ways of looking at events as sort of complementary modes of apprehending our reality. And in academic work, where I spend most of my time, you know, the sort of causal processes are predominant. You know, you have to sort of explain why, you know, this follows from that, and you know, even in non-scientific disciplines, there is a sort of an underlying pressure from a scientific way of looking about how one goes about whether one's doing something historical or even interpretative. There's a kind of pressure from a sort of scientific modality. It's very dominant. But I think what Jung is suggesting is that one can also look at some of these things in different ways, much more sort of interpretatively, much more concerned with patterns of meaning and so on. And I try to bring that into my work in various ways, and it appears in its own way. I mean, sometimes it's just noticing when these things happen. For
Mm-hmm.
example, amongst PhD students that I've taught, a surprising number of them turn up out of the blue with projects that are not about things that they know that I'm interested in because I've published on them before or something like this, but about the very things that I don't publish on because I think they're that I'm not ready or I feel they're just too wild or just or too sacred, too important to me to write about. So they come with projects that sort of speak to my blind spots or my quiet spots or whatever, and they do the work that I haven't been doing, so it saves me a lot of time, but it's they do it much better than I would as well because they're obviously drawn into it, and it's a thing that is quite compelling for them in the way that it hasn't yet become compelling for me. But these sort of patterns of who comes to study with one is very interesting. So that's one way in which it does figure, who comes to study and what they choose to write on and so on. Is one way. Yeah. So.
Yeah, that was just making me think as well of, I've been kind of meditating on, I think it was part of the essay I wrote as well, but almost as if there are nodes of knowledge or systems of knowledge that exist somewhere in the collective that people bring forth, and your work brings forth. Richard Tarnas, who I spoke to recently, there's a very, sometimes I connect with a body of work and I'm like, this is incredible. This is stuff I've been looking into and I didn't know. And there's a lot around re-enchantment. I'd not heard of your work or Richard Tarnas's work when I was looking at re-enchantment. And then I was like, wow, there's this almost like a lineage of sorts where this knowledge is being brought into, made manifest, but also more concrete in the sense of the written form, ideas in a way that we find accessible. And it seems to exist. It seems like ideas within themselves and the evolution of knowledge is a dimension that people seem synchronistically tuned into. And it it just made me think of that when you said the students that you work with, that it's almost like there's a part of the however you want to describe it, the unconscious, the higher self, the collective psyche around that, where in the unconscious there's like a shared interest, whether we're conscious of it or not. So I really, it's really interesting to hear that.
Yeah. It's there's. I mean, I think that what you're saying is sort of makes me think of this sort of more collective dimension. I was sort of saying in relation to my Mantis experience is difficult to sort of articulate, but this is it's as though at a certain point something is choosing its moment, as it were, to express it, or it's a time for it to be expressed, and various people pick up on it often independently and pursue different but related paths in relation. So yeah, I do find that quite often, really. And it's often you don't know that that's happening, and it sort of emerges later. I mean, I can tell you another incident that happened that is was quite interesting in this respect, relating to my work, where synchronicity, as it were, came into it, which is that somebody had applied to do a PhD with me, and the proposal I didn't think was quite up to it at the time. So I kind of said no, and I sort of get some feedback anyway.
Yeah.
If they want to, but they came back with another version of the proposal a few months later, and it was more interesting. I mean, the whole topic was really interesting to me. It was about the alchemical Mercurius, the image of the alchemical Mercurius in Jung's work. It was kind of almost there, but not quite. But we agreed to have an interview. So he came to visit me. The person was Matthew Mather, and he came to have an interview with me. And during the interview, we were sort of discussing various things, and he was sort of about to sort of refer me to some passage that he'd written, copied out from one of my books about something, and how it tied into something he was writing or something like this. He was good to argue. Then the phone rang in my office, and the phone call was from Robert Aziz, who, as you know, is a quite a seminal author on synchronicity, and I'd never spoken to him before. It's the first communication I'd had from him. This would have been in about 2006, I think. So it's 16 years after the publication of his book and his first book, and he wanted to talk about he was asking me if I would endorse his new book, which came out the following year, and. But I couldn't speak to him then because I was in this meeting. So we just arranged another time to talk, and then I got back to my meeting with this PhD applicant. But Matthews, had been looking in his notes and was about to read out a passage in which he had written down something which he quoted from my book, The Rupture of Time, in which I in turn quote Robert Aziz's book about on the nature of synchronicity in relationship to time.
Wow!
So this was quite a powerful sort of issue of timing, and I mean there are lots more aspects to that particular experience as well. There's lots of connections, but I won't say it was the sole factor that influenced me to take Matthew on as a PhD student, but it didn't hurt, shall we say? And he went on and wrote a very good PhD, which was subsequently published as a book as The Alchemical Mercurius and Jung and the Alchemical Mercurius. So it was an interesting kind of way in which a synchronistic moment sort of intersected with the academic environment, as it were.
Sounds like it was a ringing endorsement for that student.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was in my head. I've got to say it. It's too late now, but I've still got to say it.
Okay. Yeah.
From there, I'm wondering if we can move into, because we've touched upon like the unconscious, and the nature of these experiences as being one of relationship. You mentioned relationships then as well, and how there seems to be a relationship to the unseen within, so the unseen self and aspects of self that you could argue are trying to communicate or present in pathways of understanding, and also a relationship to out there, the world, what we perceive. How do you view synchronicity in the relationship to bridging what I guess one way of describing it would be like the mind-body problem, or bridging this issue of the dominance of materialism, conventional causal physics, you could say. How do you view synchronicity as creating a pathway, and from that, what would you say are the religious implications from that shift in perception?
Yeah. I mean, that again goes straight to the core of what's really interesting, I think, about synchronicity. I mean, to my mind, I mean, I'll remember to try and unpack both parts of this. But synchronicity is it sort of connects the psychic and our psychic and physical inner and outer kind of worlds of experience, but it also connects our empirical experience as a whole, inner and outer together, with something which sort of transcends that. So there's a kind of horizontal vertex and a vertical vertex, if I can put it that way. So the sort of implicit sort of presence and power of a sort of materialistic or physicalist way of looking at the world in the sort of dominant science of Jung's day, and still in our day, I think, is another thing that Jung and Wolfgang Pauli, with whom he did some collaboration in this area, were both trying to address. This sort of idea that reality was fundamentally material, and psyche was some kind of epiphenomenon of that. Doesn't really have the same fundamentality or reality, and therefore is not so important, and it doesn't, and therefore anything to do with the psychology is not as important as physics. The humanities aren't as important as a STEM subject. Lots of implications flow from it. But also another thing that flows from it, and I think Rick Tarnas, whom you mentioned, writes and on your podcast spoke very eloquently about this. How if you don't have a sense of, if you've got a materialist ontology, one of the implications of that is that the universe is meaningless, and apart from anything that we project onto it, it's not really got any meaning, and that we're living in a fundamentally dead and meaningless universe, which is not very inspiring to sort of sort of get one engaged in reality. But anyway, so there are very serious problems. I mean, the whole problem of disenchantment sort of kind of stems in part from that way of looking. And I think synchronistic experiences, because they give, in a sense, equal weight to the psychic and the physical, and show that there can be connections amongst psychic and physical events which are not stemming from just the psychic events are caused by the physical events, or indeed the physical events are caused by the psychic events. It suggests that there is some other order of reality that in some way or other is ordering both. Jung himself was thought a bit shy of metaphysics and thinking about the mind-body problem in a too explicit a way, or any other metaphysical issues about the fundamental nature of reality. But you can't get away with it entirely, and you can sort of tease out things that are implicit in his work. And the one thing you can be pretty confidently say is that he did not think materialism was adequate, or physicalism. What's alternative view? There are disputes about that. But probably the most coherent version of what one can put together from what he says, particularly in his work with Pauli, is a form of sort of dual aspect monism, really, where they're seeing the mind and matter, the psyche and physis as two aspects of the same underlying reality, which in itself is sort of not, the nature of that underlying reality is not sort of ascertainable, but directly, but nevertheless is ordering what we experience. So it's a kind of but you can infer about it that it's a unitary reality, it's a monism, and the various things one can infer about it. So that sort of model, which has been very ably and intricately elaborated by Harold Atmanspacher and a variety of colleagues in his book on dual aspect monism, he and Dean Rickles' book Dual Aspect Monism and the Deep Structure of Meaning, as well as loads of other papers, is a sort of quite a compelling account of how a worldview that's implied by synchronicity sort of breaks with that sort of purely materialist way of looking at things. And implies that the material reality is just, as it were, one aspect of the reality that we experience, and that the psychic reality is equally important, equally fundamental. But in fact, both of them are just aspects of a deeper unitary reality. Something that in his own work, Jung referred to as maybe the psychoid aspect of the psychoid level of the unconscious, or the unus mundus. And he had various ways of talking about it. That's quite a compelling sort of model, and it has one of the advantages of it is that it sort of it allows for one to think about religion and science as being not inveterately hostile to one another, not incompatible with one another, but reconcilable, because they're both, as it were, expressions in different ways of the same sort of underpinning reality. They're both sort of, and that to have a sort of a full sense of reality, one really needs to be able to operate in both modes, to understand understand the world causally, to understand the world in terms of the sort of archetypal patterns of meaning that are expressed within it as well. So I think the implications, that one can find in various ways in Jung's work, one can find Wolfgang Pauli saying similar things, are that that this has that synchronicity has a very profound implication for the reconciliation of a kind of scientific and religious worldviews, or spiritual worldviews. And whether one, whatever sort of model one sort of, there's probably a variety of exploration one can do within that sort of general framework about, the specifics of what kind of view of reality one has, but all of them move away from a simple materialistic point of view.
Yeah, I think that's important to remember as well, because I guess for me and my background, struggling with like my mental health, like depression, anxiety, psychosis, this for me is a huge topic. If we're to look at madness and psychosis, the worldview that we have is so defining. I mean, it is in any, like you mentioned, all these different areas in science and psychology and education, pretty much that drip down effect everywhere. But if you view, I mean, if you're rigid in that materialism, a synchronicity would be a hallucination. that it would just be, or the mind trying to join dots, but it's based on cognition, perceiving links that aren't there, which is the opposite of a synchronistic experience, at least by definition, and to me by experience. It emerges without even the conscious intention. This might be a tangent, so I won't go too far down that route, but I do like as well, because as I say that, I'm conscious of the misstep of magical thinking and the misstep of seeing with the lens of holism and seeing with the lens of synchronicity, and then neglecting the fact that those links still can be made. And that is like in schizophrenia, we call it is it apophenia, I think it is, or there's a word for detecting those patterns that aren't there. And I really like that you mentioned naive enchantment, and you speak to animism and this perception of the spiritual or the sacred, not only inwardly but outwardly, and how actually like it's not necessarily a complete return to that way of being, but like an evolution where it reintegrates that way of being, and doesn't look at kind of still has a discernment and a receptivity to synchronicity. Yeah, that might have gone off track a little there, but did you have
I think it's a really important point that you're raising, actually. I mean, as I was saying earlier, I mean, I think in formulating the concept of synchronicity, Jung was suggesting that that to have a kind of a whole judgment, a holistic judgment, it's not about seeing everything in a kind of a mushy cloud or whatever. I mean, it's being able to see things as they are kind of are together as a whole, and to have a kind of the wide view, the deeper and wider contextual view, at the same time as to be aware of the all the sort of critical stuff that is fostered by academic work and science and so on. That in a sense, when and in the work that I've done on disenchantment and reenchantment, I mean, I like to see, and I'm certainly influenced by Rick Tarnas in this. I like to see synchronicity, reenchantment as being something that is a sort of something that comes after disenchantment, and in a sense does not entirely negate disenchantment, but as it were, sort of enfolds it in a sort of a state of being able to rediscover a sense of meaning, a sense of the sacred, sense of the mysterious, at the same time as having all that sort of, everything, that all the critical faculties present and so on. That one doesn't. It's not a sort of a regression to a pre-disenchanted, pre-critical state where what I've sometimes referred to as naive enchantment, where one just sort of declines to do the work of differentiating oneself and developing one's critical ways of looking and understanding things in the kinds of way that responsible science and scholarship try to do. So it's something different. It's that from naive enchantment, reenchantment, and synchronicity. I would locate at the sort of reenchantment end of things. I think that's what it's effectively doing. So someone's not negating the value of science or of causal thinking or anything, but one's, as it were, in some way transcending it whilst also including it, if you like, still. So there's a sort of a check, hopefully, on if this is done in the kind of way that I think Jung had in mind. There's a check on that propensity to find meaning, willy-nilly everywhere, without just to use it for subjective self-aggrandizement or whatever it might be. Those sort of, and people have written. I mean, I think James Hillman wrote quite nicely about some pathologies of meaning that can occur in relation to synchronicity of that nature. So it's an interesting area. I mean, Marie-Louise von Franz also wrote about some examples of this where people have where she mentions one patient for who was thought he was Jesus or something, and was causing a disturbance, and the medics were called, and when the medics arrived at his house in the evening, the light in the hallway exploded and went dark. And the patient took this as a sign that, like Christ, like the sun darkened on Good Friday when Christ was on the cross, that this was a sort of confirmation of his kind of status as being the Messiah. But von Franz suggests that this was a light bulb after all. It was not bizarre, and that it probably more likely represents the the extinction of his consciousness, which is what he would have needed in order to sort of orient himself within his experiences and to sort of prevent the full onslaught of a psychotic episode. So there are clearly there are it's important to think about the relationship between this and pathology as well.
Yeah, because that's a great example, and I also love that you brought in the dual association, and the one that comes from the Messiah complex, and the way that someone like von Franz can say, well, actually, with a wider context of what's going on, this is how I would interpret it. And it speaks to the potential, like in Jungian terms, if there is a complex, if there are unhealed traumas, if there are rigid beliefs, it can block that view of interpretation. And I think the discernment is, as you describe with your story, and avoiding the naive enchantment, to have that really discerning scientific approach of, oh, okay, so I'm having this experience. I intuit that it means this. I've had it in my experience, like with I think I gave the example of the headless Buddha and these moments of like, does this literally mean that I'm under threat physically? And you can get a sense, and like with my own experiences, I think I've always been fortunate enough to have space within my experience. Like, for example, I had psychosis that came with paranoia, and within that, self-awareness. And that's an interesting place to be, and a terrifying place to be. But at the same time, I could pass apart and tell the projection, and the thing is, it didn't make it any easier at that degree of, like you mentioned, the porous, and I think the boundaried self, like, because my naturally a very porous self meant that even in the discernment of projection, it was still felt threatening to part of my psyche. But the ability to see within that, what's the root, like what is the root, and is this something inner, and is the association reliable? I think this is a really good point of inquiry for people that are having synchronicities, and be it from that more Messiah complex where the light bulb goes and they think they're Jesus, or also from dark synchronicities where, in both of our examples that we've used, there's a possible association that feels fearful. And there does seem to be, I've noticed it seems to be a theme, especially with dreams and myth as well. But there can be, like, the first association can often be imagery that is disturbing or violent, potentially. And then it's almost like you can go below that, and there is a sacred to the profane. It's something I'm realizing increasingly, that there almost is that dynamic at times. And for me, it often starts, not always, sometimes it starts with the sacred, but it can start with that's a disturbing image, before the balance of the sacred meaning of it surfaces. That's also a bit of a tangent, but I think it's really important to have that discernment. And my hope is that the more synchronicity is integrated, the finer the line becomes with sanity, insanity. Because no doubt someone with schizophrenia will have a mixture of genuine synchronicity, trying to aid their individuation, and also projection. But even the projection showing something, like my paranoia was showing me a self-rejection wound. So it actually was something offering me my own medicine. But it's just the first association is not the case. There's a bit of an impassioned rant.
No, that's very interesting. I mean, there's I mean, Jung wrote an interesting letter to somebody who'd asked him about this, how you sort of, I can't remember exactly what the inquiry was, but Jung, in his reply, Jung was talking about how the concept of synchronicity gives one another way of thinking about what are usually dismissed, in a blanket way as sort of delusions of reference. That sometimes, of course, there may be, it may be a simple case of delusions of reference, but sometimes there may be actual synchronistic experiences. Life can fall together in those ways, and in certain states of mind, one might be more sort of sensitive and attuned to that. And there may be, as you say, a mixture of these things, and the ability to discriminate between, what is, maybe delusional and what is synchronistic, would be, that's a kind of that's a sort of, in a sense, a discriminating function, a rational ego function. It's the kind of ability that would strengthen one's kind of ego in the kind of necessary way to be able to engage and integrate the sort of archetypal experiences that are sort of exploding within one and around one in these very troubled and difficult states of mind. So it's a helpful concept in the sense, both personally for anyone who can think, has got the sort of knowledge base to think about that whilst going through those experiences, but also for clinicians who might be working with people, not to dismiss everything as a delusion of reference or whatever, but to actually take seriously the possibility that some of what people present as seemingly psychotic behaviors and fantasies, there might actually be important things going on in them that are not necessarily just things to dismiss as destructive. So it's very complex, but I think the concept of synchronicity is an interesting and important one for people who are working therapeutically in this area, because it does show, another sort of modifies the kind of attitude one would have towards the sort of therapeutic attitude one would have towards the material, makes one more aware of possibilities of what can happen, that is not necessarily pathological.
Yeah, and guidance from that person's psyche as well, and almost like the radical, and I know Jung was of this thinking, but like the radical faith in that person's psyche, rather than pathologizing to say there's a wider, more expansive part of you that is trying to get your attention, trying to communicate. And I've often pondered, like, what is that difference? What is that distinction? I do like the model of this idea of having a healthy ego in the Jungian terminology of that discernment center. I think that is really important. I was really surprised as well, like reading your paper, just to see how, because you mentioned how little research, and even Jung himself, how little focus there was on synchronicity in that therapeutic context. I didn't realize how it was an area that was almost not overlooked, but not really explored deeply.
Yeah, obviously there's more now. It's there's increasing interest in it, but still, there's the scope for more, perhaps. I mean, there are difficulties because, I mean, the best laboratory for looking at it and understanding it, of course, is the analytic setting, where people are in the analytic relationship. If people are meeting several times a week, maybe 4 times a week in some cases or more, they can go into tremendous depth into what's going on, the context of what's going on, and really understand the dynamics of these experiences in a very, very profound way. But it's there are confidentiality issues. There are difficulties of articulating what's going on, either in a way that maintains anonymity, or even if one's not trying to attain anonymity, in reality. Just the material is so ambiguous and so strange and so much in process. Because one of the things that obviously will that emerges is that things are not just sort of symptoms don't come in sort of matchbox shaped sizes and portions, and you can kind of maneuver them around or put them away and all this kind of thing. Everything is kind of flowing and in process and complexly interrelated to everything else, and it's very difficult to get a perspective that really captures something, because things move on even as you're speaking, and in fact through your speaking you're changing the way things are and so on. So there's an element which is also probably about learning to be able to be much more in thinking in a flow, I suppose. But that's that is tricky to do.
Yeah, and you mentioned as well the phrase, like, just the influx of material from the unconscious, and that, I think I've been lucky to have developed a meditation practice, which for me at times has been the practice of holding myself whilst a lot of material is surfacing in a way that is incredibly overwhelming. And I think that without that grounding in that practice, madness makes complete sense to me. When there's just an influx of like you say, it is just so hard to discern. It can create fearful associations very quickly, confusion. It's not easy. And I appreciate probably the way that we may have spoken about this at times might make it sound like, I'm interpreted this way, but I'm sure you've gone through a long process of getting there, as have I, and that's only experiences that I've made coherent, and there are still things that I'm like, I've got no idea what that means, and it might take years or decades. But yeah, there is almost like a very gradual process of something becoming coherent from the primordial soup of symbol, and as an extension. I'm conscious of the time, but I wonder, as we move towards the end, because we talk about archetypes, speak about symbols, I'd love to approach myth and mythology, and maybe to look at that in the sense of what a lot of people, there are two associations people will make if they're not so familiar. One is myth in the sense of not true. And one is myth in the sense of a fictional story or fairy tale. How, in your context and in the context of the inner world and even synchronicity, would you describe myth and religion? I almost forgot we're talking about religion as well. That's like the aim, but also with the religious myth, and how that emerges in these different religious cultures.
Well, I would, the way I would tend to think about myth, and of course, people popularly can talk about myth as the myth of this, that, or the other is something that's untrue, and they want to dismiss it. But myth, in a sense, as a sacred story, is something that is fictional in the sense that it didn't probably happen in a literal sense exactly as is described, but nevertheless could be true in the sense that it's articulating in metaphorical or symbolic language something that is very real. That's how I would see myths and the power of myths, and why myths last. Myths are one very concise definition of myth are just the stories that last. They're the stories that have the power to keep being told in different forms and so on. Well, I mean, from Jung's point of view, or which I have a lot of sympathy for in this area, myths are the sort of, he calls them the culturally elaborate. Well, he implies, this is a bit of a synthesis of things he says, but he implies that they're sort of culturally elaborated expressions of archetypal motifs or archetypal happenings. So for Jung, the archetypal events are the kind of like the core elements of myths, which then get sort of culturally elaborated into story, and in a sense amplified through the story in various ways. So at the core of the myth, there is this very deep level, the kind of level we were talking about before, where beyond the sort of merely psychic and merely physical, but this sort of archetypal, the domain of the archetypes as such in Jung's understanding before they express themselves as archetypal images. This is the source of mythology, I think, in Jung's understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And so the stories that cultures have sort of developed and encapsulated in myth, when the myths are still alive and still seem to speak, do so because in some way, in some partial way, they articulate something from that very, very deep level, and the myth is powerful because one doesn't know exactly what it means, but nevertheless it's gripping. It seems to be saying something. It seems to be still speaking. I mean, one powerful myth that Jung thought developed, in the sort of Middle Ages, but still Jung thought still in his own day, he found it tremendously powerful, was the myth or legend of the Grail, which he continued to be interested in right through his life, so he didn't feel that he knew definitively what this myth was or what it was trying to say. A lot of his work, you could say, was in a sense unpacking that, in an oblique way as well, because his wife was writing a book on it and he didn't want to trespass in her territory. But nevertheless, it was there's something that's sort of inexhaustible about the myths. And when you think about it, one of the things I find interesting in relation to synchronicity and myth is that that Jung's thinking about myth, you could see in a purely intrapsychic way. You could see, that the myths, you read about myths, or read the stories of a sacred text and read them in a mythic way, or whatever. That these are stories that are about inner psychic processes of development and so on. And it's very important to have this perspective because that brings them alive again. So you're reading about Greek mythology and you're not just reading what the ancient Greeks believed in a fanciful way that couldn't possibly be true and that's not really got any relevance and might just have a certain amount of beauty when a poet manages to write it up in a nice way. It's something that's still vitally relevant to you now. This is really important. But I think Jung goes beyond that. I think he agrees that that's his basic theory of myth. But when he's got the concept of synchronicity, he's also implicitly saying that these myths are not just intrapsychic phenomena, but they can express themselves in the way in which external reality configures itself as well. And they can manifest in one's life and express themselves in one's life,
Yeah.
So, I mean, a couple of examples of that would be Jung's own experience with the scarab beetle, his patient with the scarab beetle, which on the one hand, and this is what you get in his essay, it's about his patient's experience and her, the scarab is an ancient Egyptian symbol of rebirth, and the patient has a rebirth experience, within her analysis and so on, and that's all very apt. But also, the scarab meant a great deal to Jung. It was an image that had appeared in his own fantasies, and had a very rich set of associations for him. And this idea of the rebirth is also symbolic of what he was hoping his concept of synchronicity might be able to do. So in a sense, the experience was also relevant much more broadly than just in this sort of the context of this patient. It had a much wider significance, and perhaps an even clearer example. Although we won't have time to go into it in depth. But you mentioned the example that I include in one of my papers in one of my books of Edward Thornton, who had a series of I suggest there were 11 different synchronistic events that occurred together in this series of events that happened to him over a period of time. Some of them, the events involved images of the owl. Some of the events involved images of a wound or a cut, chopping to the head. But as they unfolded, it gradually became clear that these different images and motifs were expressions of a mythic motif, the birth of Athena, where Glaucopis, the owl-eyed goddess Athena, was born from the head of Zeus when Hephaestus chops Zeus's head and so on. So all these different images that the experience of Thornton had all converge in this myth. And it seems that in some way, the myth of the birth of Athena, transposed into Christian terms by Thornton to some extent, because he relates Athena to the Virgin Mary and her aspect as the seat of wisdom. So, but anyway, this myth works itself out in Thornton's life, in a way that is radically transformative for him, results in him having sort of, tumor removed from his brain, from his head, skull cut open, like Zeus and so on, and owl experiences, owl synchronicities abounding and so on. So it's very interesting how the myth, as it were, enacts itself in reality. And he never, not as though fully what it means. You can formulate it as being, the presence of the divine mother or whatever it is, but what does that mean? It's a myth that is charged with significance and profoundly transformative.
Yeah, this is a great example, because you mentioned synchronicity, or let's just say basic coincidence, can be, even if it's acausal. I thought something happened, but there is also, and I think Jung described this as almost like the how synchronicities will increasingly become more impossible over time. Like it's like you might be able to argue that the first two of those in the example you gave, like the first two is very, very unlikely probability, but they continue to become more and more impossible. And there is, and I'm articulating this kind of for the first time as I share this, but the myth of synchronicity being the growing emergence of meaning, even like fractal meaning, where each moment of synchronicity has an inherent value, but it grows and it grows. And in some instances, there is a crescendo, a coalesce of the mothership of that meaning, so to speak, or the core moment outside of time. And it was for Edward, where he's in the hospital bed, right? And he looks out and he sees this statue. And all of these other moments from there have led him to that moment in the bed where he's in a great deal of suffering and uncertainty with his health. And he sees it. And all of those moments were part of the story of the myth of that synchronicity to support him then. And there does seem to be, like with the headless Buddha, it was growing. There was a really fun moment actually where it was expanding. and the meaning was growing, and I was getting different synchronicities, also interconnected to other synchronicities as well, which can be quite a lot to be with. And I think I got caught up in, what does this mean? Like what, like there's something in Alan Watts's work, and I was inquiring and looking. And eventually I think I found a quote from Alan Watts, which was about the trick or the cosmic joke of just like chasing your own tail. And it was like, oh, it was that moment of, yeah, no, I'm trying, I've had the apparition, so to speak. I've had these moments of meaning, and more may come, and then maybe more exposure to what it means, but that's not my choosing. And if I try and like create more meaning from it, it's almost like it might evade like synchronicity as a spirit or an entity might then kind of evade that need for control, but then emerge in times when it's needed. And this does seem to be a quality as well. For me, I've had synchronicities when I felt particularly disenchanted, and I've had long spells of darkness with no synchronicities, where it's felt like I really need a synchronicity right now to kind of pull me out.
So they don't come to order.
Yeah.
They don't often come to order.
No, but this is it. Yeah. But there is like myth and time. And I know you mentioned this in your disenchantment, re-enchantment paper of with the secular age, like higher time and secular time. And that shift to a more, we mistake that linearity, the technology of time as a measuring device. We mistake that with what time actually is. But there is a transcendent element to synchronicity that seems to, in our linear experience, play back, start paving the way. Sometimes in prophecy, but sometimes more in just an inner psychic event that can be just as meaningful as psychic breakthrough. Not necessarily a moment in the world, but now I'm all inspired and going off on one. So there you go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's there's a danger, when these things kind of come thick and fast, of kind of, one can end up fetishizing synchronicity, and I suppose maybe the thing to think is that the phenomenon, such as it is, doesn't really need that. I mean, if and maybe there are, there's a sort of one aspect of synchronicity, I think, and of what Jung was trying to do with synchronicity, was about sort of timing, in the sense that when we spoke earlier about how he was trying to sort of complement a sort of a causal way of thinking with a synchronistic way of thinking to create a kind of a whole judgment, as it were, and the more and that sort of whole judgment, as it were. The contribution to it, part of the contribution to it from the more holistic way of thinking, the more kind of thinking in terms of the whole, the more synchronistic way of thinking, I think is maybe that there is a right moment for certain things, so that we tend to think when we're doing scholarship or science, that I've done this experiment and that leads, and I've now got to do the next one, and I've got to do that, and now I'm doing scholarship and I've pursued this line of inquiry and I've got to do that, and I've got to write this, and I've got to figure that out. But and within the sort of logic of the sort of all the sort of connections, the causal connections that one's finding, and so all of that sort of flows and generates itself and so on. But maybe that it's maybe there's also a time for these things, and part of the judgment that is contributed by a more kind of holistic sense to one's overall sort of evaluation of situations is to say, well, maybe this isn't the time to go more deeply into that, to explore these associations more, to perform this next experiment now. Maybe one doesn't have to, maybe there's something else more important to do. And that, if one attends to one's reality more holistically, then one will find that, there are more important things to do than to be, as you say, chasing, the cosmic
chasing
joker.
The high.
Yeah, chasing the high. Yeah,
Chasing the high. It's beautifully put, and kind of brings us full circle to the subheading of your book, or this like revelations of chance, it wouldn't, without that nature of at times a sense of divine intervention or divine timing, it would lack a lot of its potency. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Sometimes it being in the dark is exactly where we're supposed to be. Be that a lack of synchronicity, overwhelmed with association. I know I've had moments where I felt completely forsaken from this dimension and just been, like, give me a sign, give me a sign. And that's usually, maybe sometimes there's a sign, or that's usually a point to kind of care for myself in a different way. But overall, I just want to express so much gratitude for your work and for this conversation. It feels really like there is that theoretical, but I really like that there's a lot that is practical, and I feel that people tuning in will take away not only value from the discussion, but actual pointers that are viable to apply to this experience. And I'd invite anyone listening to I guess act out that divination of synchronicity and invite the synchronicity in without any expectation or chasing the high.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's a nice balanced way to recommend it then.
Yeah, Roderick, thanks so much for your time. Much appreciated. And yeah, I look forward to seeing how our paths cross in future as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been an enjoyable conversation for me too, so thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Mind That Ego podcast. To stay up to date, you can join the Mind That Ego mailing list if you head to mindthatego.com/MFM. You'll also get a copy of my book, Mindsets for Mindfulness, when you join. You can also follow Mind That Ego on Facebook and YouTube, where the podcasts are also displayed in video format along with other inspired videos that I create. Or if Instagram is more your social media of choice, you can follow me at Ricky_Deriz. That's DERISZ.